we get a lot of our money from. So like right now, the Congress, I don't remember, does anybody know, does it go to the House first or the Senate first when it goes to Congress? I always mix them up. But I'm pretty sure in Congress we have a $3.5 trillion bill. And that's huge. That's like, I think 10 years ago they were passing a bill for 800 billion, which was not even a trillion. Now our bills 12 years later after 2010 are 3 times that. So it shows inflation. It shows how much money is being printed and how many resources are being created. But that kind of gets your social policy going. So social policies are basically the principles and courses of action that shape quality of life. Like in America, we've had a lot of policies that have been created since the U.S. Constitution. And anybody remember what year the Constitution was signed? I should know this, but I'm not a history buff. I feel like it was 1776. Because you always hear them like talking about the first presidents and all that. And we started pushing through different legislation. Most of it centered around how to like feed and house people and keep them healthy. So the purpose of public policies are to either redress inequities in social institutions or to provide assistance to persons in need. So a lot of our social work agencies are the ones who help distribute that, whether it's through the food bank or our food pantries or different, affordable housing spaces and whatnot. So, and a lot of other governments have kind of mimicked our governments. That's very similar to even British common law that they started way back when. So as a process, you first have a policy formation. So right now, that $3.5 trillion bill is supposed to have a lot of infrastructure in it. Like you ever drive on a crappy road and it has potholes on it and your car's like, it like crash and it's just bad. So your city is supposed to get money and like fix the potholes and fill them in. So that's kind of where policy formation will begin. Or if they notice during the pandemic, the coronavirus, that a lot of people got laid off or got sick or couldn't work. So there's a lot of money pushed through the system last year. This morning on the radio, I heard NPR, which is National Public Radio, talk about when the pandemic was supposedly over. Do you guys remember in May when we like all took our masks off and like everything was good? I guess you guys would have all been seniors in high school, right? You probably were allowed to have graduations. So pandemic was over. And then something happened. I don't know what happened. But he took as a researcher from Harvard, and he did a study to ask how Americans in general feel. Do you feel okay about your economic situation in life, your health situation in life, overall? And so he was actually expecting us to be feeling good because the pandemic was over. It was in May. You take your mask off. They had the vaccine, so like whoever wanted to get it could get it, and we'd be okay. But what do you guys think he actually found instead? They're reporting on the results this morning about this summer's survey. Like, how do you feel since coronavirus? And how's your economic outlook? How's your job outlook? He thought it would look good and it would be all good news, but it turned out because the second Delta variant was starting and like they were telling us all to get masks on again and shutdowns and spreads. So he found a lot of people were just getting their last unemployment check that came through our social policy. They just got all the money that the government was going to give them, but it wasn't as much as they thought or needed, and that people were still like suffering. Um, and so he actually got different results than he expected. He thought they would be like, hooray, the pandemic's over and we're all going to party now. And it wasn't. So for whatever reason, it ramped back up again in June and July and almost shut down school in August, but it didn't. So we're back to that information gathering and policy implementation. So they're trying to see what way it spreads, how many people will get sick and die from it, etc. So social policy as a product, you look at your different programs and services, the different legislation and executive orders, and different congressional actions. So we have three branches of government in the U.S. You've got that executive order would be the president. I don't know why it always does that. Congressional actions are through Congress, which is the Senate and the House of Representatives. And judicial is like our Supreme Court. So that's what they call the balance of powers. There's a lot of social workers that help push our policies through. As social workers, we try to do policy analysis. So you want to check out on policy, like the specifics about it, specifications, the feasibility, like if you're able to do the policy, if we have enough money to print $3 trillion, like that's the most recent one. Or if we have the materials to make enough bridges or roads or whatever. And then the merits of it, like, is this a smart thing to do? Like there is one policy thing I wanted to show you guys, because this was early today. Well, there's a new senator that wants to push this legislation here, and it's kind of interesting. So let's see here. So the male Democratic lawmaker proposes legislation to force men to have a vasectomy once they have had 3 kids or when they turn 40. Have any of you guys heard about this? This one was just proposed last week, and it's in response to the Texas abortion ban. So it says all men will be forced to have a vasectomy within 6 weeks of having their 3rd child or turning 40. Which is also crazy because I had my first kid at 42 and my second kid at 43. So if he snipped me at 40, I wouldn't have any kids. But this is getting pushed through the democratic process, kind of like what we were talking about earlier, the forced sterilization and forced, so Representative Chris Rabb introduced a legislation which grants a $10,000 reward to private citizens who report violators of the law to the authorities. So if you don't get snipped or vasectomy a man, they cut your like vas deferens, which helps you to make a baby. He said it was inspired by the Illinois Democratic Representative Kelly Cassidy, who introduced a law on the 14th aimed at protecting abortion in her state. The bill drew criticism on Twitter and Rep. Barb Gleam, who said progressives completely disregard your personal medical freedom. So, any of you guys heard about that one? So that means by the age of 40, all men got to cut their vas deferens or like not be able to make. I don't know if this will pass because it doesn't sound very constitutional. It sounds a bit of invasion of privacy, like just like the videos we watched about forced. It almost sounds like forced sterilization to me. So I don't know if it will pass. And that's it's in the beginning phases of this. So where we are here, on like the feasibility, the specifications, I don't know if that's feasible. So that means all men will have to go into a surgeon. Like I'm 43, if that passed, maybe that would mean they retrofit it for me. They put me under the knife, they cut out my stuff, and I can't have kids. So I don't know if it will pass or not. We'll see what happens with it. Any thoughts on that one? I've never seen it until now. Would you guys be okay with getting snipped at 40? That's what I said. All the men in here, stand up for yourselves. You want to keep your vas deferens and not get snipped, or I would say it probably won't pass because I feel like, well, it would be the same as saying it, forced women rip out your uterus. It's similar to take out the ovaries. I don't think that they can invade your body that way, which is kind of the route that was going. But we'll see. Maybe Congress has changed and that will pass. So these are the social policy and political ideologies you hear about. There's a lot more than this, but there's either liberals, conservatives, radicals, and then you have your social work and political ideologies. As I said, there's a lot more than just liberals and conservatives. There's a full spectrum. Like there's some that are like libertarians and the Green Party and different spectrums. So why are we talking about social policy? It's because social work and social policy become important because we, again, get a lot of our funding this way, and this is how we kind of help support folks that need it. So I know this is an interesting sentence, but it says our social work practice informs policy, and then policy informs our practice. Anybody want to take a guess at what that means? Practice informs policy, and policy informs practice. If you were to guess what it means, what would you say? Because it is true. And for social work majors, you'll hear this like almost the rest of your life because this is part of our core curriculum, so to speak. So when we practice social work, like that could be helping people get housing, helping people get food access, go to a food pantry. That helps inform our policymaking decisions. So if we don't have enough food in the country and people are starving, do you want to pass a policy that we have more access to food banks and a policy that gets rid of all food deserts where they like maybe even open up where you can grow a garden in Los Angeles like they did. Whereas their policy before that was you're not allowed to grow any gardens in the city of Los Angeles if it's on the sidewalk. And then they changed that. And then the reverse of that, policy informs practice. So is the policy that's being put out there like food banks, food security, food issues, or this infrastructure bill that's coming up? Like, are the bridges safe or are they continuing to collapse when big heavy semis drive on them? Our policies inform that practice. Like, should we continue building safe infrastructure? Should we continue serving clients with the food bank? Because supposedly the food insecurity got twice as bad during the pandemic. So a lot more people were hungry. Kids that relied on school lunches and school breakfast did not get the school breakfast because school was closed. So they had to open up other places to feed folks. So that's kind of what they mean. And then integration of policy and practice. If you're in social work, you'll all at some point do direct practice and like your field seminar, your senior year. And same with any major that you are, you'll eventually practice what your major is. And you'll all have an agency or organizational policy. Even if you started your own agency, you might need to follow some of those guidelines. And there's different fields of practice. So with social work and social policy, we have a social service system. You also have the social welfare institution, and then societal context, and then global context and international policy. So this follows from your global social work paper, like a big common theme besides climate change. Like a lot of them are saying that because climate changing, we're having more food insecurity and the inability to grow food. And that could either be from global warming or global cooling. We actually have more global cooling or longer winters that are supposed to come in the next 9 years. And there's different policies that will go up for that. Like right now, apparently China is not growing enough food for themselves. So they had to take they bought a lot of the US soybeans, a lot of the US corn. I want to see has anybody here ever been to China? I think it's 2021. They're having a lot of photos about the China food crisis. So they're a little bit bigger country than India, but you have to sign in. Let's see if it works. So some policies will have to be changed for China because of the energy crisis and food crisis. So has anybody tried to buy a new phone recently? Like an iPhone? Is there still like a wait for it? How long is the wait?
I think like
Okay. And that's kind of has to do with this food. So China's energy crisis is in everything from iPhones to milk. Let's see if it lets me block that. So there's a lot of issues going on in China. I thought that would give us like kind of a cleaner story. Maybe we'll go to images. So they've had a lot of flooding. They've also had some policy that they've pushed that like you can't throw food away, like you have to eat a certain amount of your plate. I don't know who tracks all this, but the flooding has been kind of what's been most disastrous in China. So they have 1.5 billion people to feed, and this year they did not grow enough food for those 1.5 billion people. So they bought a lot of the commodities. Maybe they're buying some from Russia, but they bought a lot of stuff from the United States. Does Russia produce enough food for itself? Okay. Because it's cold up there. It might be hard to grow. So that's one of the issues that's coming up. And how China's, with the energy crunch, they used to grow a lot of their food indoors, and now it's hard to grow indoor food if you don't have energy to like heat the greenhouses and keep it warm enough and turn on the lights to grow the food. So there was a few things coming on. You don't see it as much in the news as you would want, but this was even reported almost a year ago.
A lot of people that have cats are unknowingly doing something that is shortening their pet's life. I'm in a veterinary.
The cat's going to die.
Earlier this year, Xi Jinping had made an appeal. He wanted the Chinese to clean their plates. That statement kicked off a campaign to conserve food, leading many to believe that China is witnessing a shortage. Months after Xi Jinping's appeal, China has launched a global hunt for grains. Our next report tells you more.
2020 will be a year that Xi Jinping would like to forget. His list of problems keeps growing. It began with the Wuhan virus that led to record unemployment, poverty, an economic slowdown, and a global backlash. Now, China could be struggling to ensure it has enough food for every citizen. Earlier this year, Xi Jinping appealed to all Chinese citizens to clean their plates. As if on cue, the Chinese state media began a campaign. Citizens were encouraged to order less, while restaurants rewarded those who wiped their plates clean. In August, restaurants in Chinese cities were rewarding customers to clean their plates with coupons and cash rebates.
So could you imagine if they did this in the United States? Like anybody eat out this weekend or go anywhere to eat? Or like even order Grubhub or DoorDash or something like that. So they're basically monitoring. Like that's kind of where their policy is starting to trickle down, where they're like, that might be a little bit too much food you're ordering there. If you could order half that and make sure to eat all of that and throw away none of that. That's kind of what they're saying here, which is different.
At market hotels, like the Marriott, trimming their buffets. by taking off dishes from the menu. The price of a buffet at the Sheraton in Ningbo went down to $22 per person because of their reduced food options. Why was this public campaign necessary? Because China may not have enough fresh food to go around. Reportedly, several food items are in short supply. There is a shortage of pork after an outbreak of African swine fever. Reports say pork prices in China soared 135% in February this year. Corn could be in short supply too. Reports say this year's corn crop has been ruined by floods. Supplies of the eggs, seafood, and green vegetables were affected too. The Chinese state media denies all claims of the food crisis, but Beijing is reaching out to suppliers. It is on a global hunt for supplies. China's imports of barley, corn, sorghum, and wheat have jumped by more than 83%. Reportedly, there could be a shortfall of 20 to 30 million tons of grain this season.
So right now, if you guys drive around this area, you'll see people harvesting this type of stuff. They got those big like John Deere tractors and combines, and they're picking the soybeans and the corn. And this is China's like buying it as fast as we can put it out. So hopefully we're keeping enough here to feed everybody in the United States. It seems to be, but prices are going up. So it makes me wonder, like how much are we keeping and how well. It seems to be a good crop year, like there's plenty of food, but it's definitely getting more expensive.
Beijing could be trying to fill the gap with imports. Buyers have already locked in 17 million tons of corn for 2020 to 2021. China does waste an awful amount of food. Back in 2015, the Chinese Academy of Sciences estimated that 17 to 18 million tons of food was wasted in China. This should be enough to feed a country about the size of South Korea.
Have you guys ever seen these YouTube videos? It's like people just smashing, like they're just like stuffing their face, and I guess they like make a video of it. So I guess they're also kind of cracking down on that, and not letting you eat as much as you want. And
China is now the world's largest agricultural importer. It is now banking on the same imports to tackle a looming food crisis. The United Nations predicts the world is facing a food crisis that hasn't been seen in at least 50 years. China seems to be in the middle of such a crisis. And now it could be buying up every grain that is available in the global market. Bureau report, we are world is one.
so most of those grains are produced in the U.S. Some people are passing legislation that you can't buy grains from, like, I believe Brazil and a few others that are big exporters. They're making sure they can feed their own nation first and then exporting out. As you can see, the number of stories going up. So China's energy problems impacting food security. Is food security becoming another big challenge for China? Watch out, it cannot feed itself. And why the nation's food crisis is more of a livestock feed challenge. So we may soon see some policies that are like geared towards making sure we grow enough food so that we can eat enough food. I know it seems weird in the US, but we still have 1 out of 5 people will experience food insecurity, like for whatever reason. It could be like last year with the pandemic and the shelves being empty, or something similar to that. Here's a chart of that, how practice informs policy, and then policy informs practice. So at the top, you have your client and social worker. When you guys finish school, you become a social worker. You work for an agency and organization. You may all work in a different field of practice. You have mental health, income maintenance, housing, child welfare, corrections. You have your social service system. So that's all fields of practice, like public and private organizations, professional associations, accrediting agencies, funders, citizen interest groups. Then you have your social welfare institution, which would be health, education, welfare, and then society. So culture, you'll have different ideologies and social structures in that. Even social institutions, I keep kicking the cord and it kicks it off. And then at the end, global, so human rights in the world community. So as we practice, we see different things that need to be done and pushed in legislation. You might see a shortage of housing that's causing a lot of homelessness. You may see a lack of food banks or a ton of food deserts. That's something that comes up. The opioid crisis in America was a big one. So since the Afghan war in 2001, we bought 98% of our opium from Afghan farmers. So like heroin, opium, and things of that nature. We then had an addiction crisis in like '05 to '09, which pushed legislation to have like detoxification centers and rehab centers. So like to either take methadone or to take Suboxone to quit heroin. And then our policy influences practice, so it goes then back in reverse. As you see the addiction recovery working, you need less addiction recovery centers. You close those down. Maybe you open up, say, a coronavirus help center. Like we probably won't have as much research money for AIDS this year as we do for coronavirus. Although AIDS is still big, we didn't have any AIDS research before the 1980s. There was no such thing as AIDS, which is the autoimmune deficiency syndrome. But now we have tons of research to prevent AIDS, to also help with maintenance if you catch HIV or AIDS. And now coronavirus, there'll be a lot of monies pushed forward to developing vaccines, making the vaccines better, making them safe so nobody has to get sick or die from them. And kind of keep pushing those different policies. So they work hand in hand as you see stuff happening. Here are some examples of how policy influences practice. So it will determine the interaction between clients and practitioners. It reflects the intent of the agency. It establishes your service priorities. Maybe you want to, in Cincinnati, we watched the overdose movie and it was 100 overdoses in like a month's time. So by lowering the number of overdoses, you're showing that there's not as much of a drug epidemic with heroin and opioids in general. Then you establish service priorities because maybe after people get sober, they need housing again and job training. And then you identify other target population groups, maybe even after that, giving recovery to the family members and folks that need it, that suffered from the addict. Here's some examples of ways policy influences practice. So it'll stipulate funding parameters. Like 10 years ago, Ohio got $500 million to end the opioid epidemic. Kentucky got about $400 million. So you'll see some of that money being printed. It specifies jurisdictional boundaries and then directs practice activities. So we had a lot of methadone clinics pop up around then that helped stop the heroin epidemic. Then the researcher Lipsky had stuff on street level services. So there's street level bureaucracies, which is like the governmental service sector, and lots of examples of that. The street level bureaucrats, they help with allocating welfare and protect public safety, and then they're subject to bureaucratic constraints. Lipsky also showed street level clients, so labeling and the social construction of clients. As you see more people getting hooked on, well, in like '05 and '06, the medical industry prescribed a lot of painkillers and a lot of people got hooked on the pain pills. Then when they were no longer prescribed them, people were still addicted, so they went to heroin instead. And as social workers, we saw that on the street and the need for more addiction recovery centers. So we would call out and ask our legislators for money and funding to do addiction recovery agencies. So here's your history of public welfare. You've got the progressive era, and that was the 1910s and 1920s. It's interesting because this reminds me of where we are kind of right now. Did anybody ever hear of the 20s called the Roaring 20s? And there was a lot of free flowing money in the 1920s, and they banned alcohol in around the 1930s, and that's when we went into the Great Depression. Does anybody know what got us out of the Great Depression after the 1930s? The war. Yep. Yeah, we went to war in 1941 against Germany, which kind of like started with Hitler in the 1930s, and I think 1939. Maybe even part of Russia had the communism there too. I don't remember. Did Russia help fight communism, or did they?
Communism?
Yeah.
Yes, they were fighting Hitler, not communism.
So were they working with him? You were saying, or they were?
I guess Hitler was not for communism.
He was more for like dictatorship. You're saying?
Yes.
Yeah. So socialism, communism. I know we use them interchangeably here, but I don't remember. Was Russia against the U.S. or for the U.S.?
No, we were against Hitler.
Right. That's what I thought. But
So we were probably together.
right. What about in World War One? Is that where it was reversed?
It was complex.
Yeah. Okay. And that was like even the Bolsheviks and stuff. Yeah. Okay. So weirdly enough, war gets a lot of people out of economic despair because it's it is very complex. But that was the 40s and the 50s. Then we had the civil rights movement in the 60s. So here's a list of some of the stuff that was passed, like the history of public welfare. And I'm going to zoom in on this because this was complicated. But we had Social Security Act passed during the Great Depression in 35. World War II started in 1941, and we had the executive order by FDR barring racial discrimination in defense industries and establishing a Federal Fair Employment Practices Committee. In 44, they had Services Readjustment Act, so like the GI Bill of Rights. In 1950, there was amendments to Social Security Act and aid for permanently disabled. 60s, there was a lot of legislation, so you can see all of these right here. We had the Social Security Act, the Civil Rights Act in 64, Economic Opportunity Act, and the Food Stamp Act, all in 64. In 65, there was amendments to Social Security and create Medicare and Medicaid. And in 71, more amendments to Social Security Act for the work incentive program. Like if you worked, you could continue receiving welfare until you got a good enough job. In 75, we had Title 20 amendments to Social Security Act. In 81, the Omnibus Reconciliation Act, Family Support Act in 88, and then this modern one, 1990, was Americans with Disabilities Act. So if you get time and a half on tests for dyslexia or ADHD or any accommodation, it comes from the Americans with Disabilities Act. Clinton passed the Family and Medical Leave Act, that's